In this module, we're going to look at some of the nitty-gritty details about how a particular kind of implicature works. I should warn you from the beginning, not all implicatures work this way. There's a lot of different kinds of implicatures, and we're only talking about one special kind of implicature. But so the point of this module is not to tell you something that applies to all of pragmatics, but it's to give you sort of a feel, sort of an example for the kinds of issues that we often deal with in trying to understand and explain a particular kind of pragmatic phenomenon. So for a few modules in the past, we've talked about scalar implicatures. These are the implicatures that come up when someone says something, but by saying that, they also suggest that something stronger or more specific is not the case, right? So the example we've been seeing a lot is if someone says, Josh is smart, then we might think that person actually means he's kind of smart, he's smart enough, but he's not brilliant, he's not a genius. This is an example of a scalar implicature. And if you recall, in some previous modules, we went into a lot of detail about the steps that we go through to understand that meaning. So we talked about how first we have to realize the person could have said Josh is brilliant, and they chose not to say that. They chose to say something less specific instead. And then we go through some more steps to reason about why they must then mean that they don't think Josh is brilliant. So here we're going to focus on that first step, the step where we realize and we think, why didn't that person say Josh is brilliant? So here what we have is there's a stronger alternative that the person could have said. Instead of saying Josh is smart, they could have said Josh is brilliant, and that's stronger, is more specific, it's a bigger compliment, it gives more information, something like that. So the whole process of getting this scalar implicature starts from thinking about that stronger alternative and asking ourselves, why didn't she say that? Why did she say something else? So figuring out this alternative and wondering why a person didn't say it is like the very important, maybe first step of understanding what the person meant. So in this example that we looked at, a person said Josh is smart. The alternative that they could have said but didn't say is Josh is brilliant. So it kind of looks like the relationship between this utterance and its alternative is just switching out one word. Right? We switch smart for brilliant. So we replace one word for a more specific word or a stronger word. So in this case, it looks like switching one word is how we get an alternative. But in fact, the alternatives will not always be the same number of words or the same size as the things they're replacing. So in another module earlier, we talked about disjunctive ignorance implicatures. So if you remember, we had an example where if someone says, there's a prize behind either door number 1 or door number 2, that means that the person's not sure there's a prize behind door number 1. Right? And in this case, the alternative is he could have just directly said there's a prize behind door number 1, but he chose not to. He chose to say door number 1 or door number 2 instead. He kind of did a hedge. So in this case, the alternative is actually shorter than what the person really said. And we can also see examples where the alternative is longer. So we have kinds of implicatures called ad hoc implicatures, where, for example, if I say, throughout my life, I've lived in the USA and I've lived in the UAE, then a person might often think those are the only 2 places I've lived, because they might think, well, like I chose not to say I've lived in the USA, UAE, and France. So if I say I've lived in the USA and UAE, maybe I'm suggesting that I haven't lived in France. So here, the alternative that I could have said is longer than what I really said. So it doesn't seem like there's a purely systematic relationship between what people say and the alternative. The alternative could be something the same length, or it could be shorter, or it could be longer. So how can we define what is a stronger alternative, given that it can't just be switching out one word or switching out a shorter or longer thing. So I'll just skip right to the answer. In a lot of pragmatic theories of how these implicatures work, we say that something is a stronger alternative. We define that based on entailment. So I'll say it in the abstract way first, and then we'll look at some concrete examples. Abstractly, we say if we have some utterance B and we have some utterance A, B can be a stronger alternative for A if B entails A, but A does not entail B. So here's an example of what that actually means. Let's imagine that I have like 7 friends that I'm talking about, and I tell you, maybe you're having computer problems or something, and I tell you, one of my friends will help you fix that computer. But I could say more. I could say one of my smart friends is going to help you fix your computer. Or I could say one of my brilliant friends is going to help you fix your computer. That could be sort of narrowing down which friend I'm talking about. So let's imagine in reality, maybe out of these 7 friends in my example, maybe 5 of them are smart. So if I tell you one of my smart friends is going to help you out with your computer, I've narrowed down which friend I'm talking about. I'm not saying one of those 2 friends on the left is going to help. One of these other 5 will help. Now let's also imagine out of these 5 smart friends, maybe 2 of them are really smart. We could even say they're brilliant. So if I say one of my brilliant friends is going to help you with your computer, I've narrowed down the set even more. If I say one of my smart friends is going to help you with your computer, and you have to guess which one I'm talking about, you can narrow it down to 5 people, right? You could guess between those 5 people which one I mean. But if I say one of my brilliant friends is going to help you, you can make a better guess because you can narrow it down to 2 people. So this kind of shows what I mean by entailment. So saying one of my brilliant friends, that's a stronger alternative than saying one of my smart friends, because it provides more information. It narrows down the set of what I could be saying into a narrower set. And to go back to the abstract definition we saw, brilliant entails smart, right? So if someone is brilliant, they must be smart. And the circle of this set of brilliant people in this picture is completely inside the set of smart people, but it's not the other way around. Smart does not entail brilliant. If someone is smart, they might not be brilliant. They could be brilliant, they might not be brilliant. So here we see that brilliant entails smart. Smart does not entail brilliant. So that's why brilliant is a stronger alternative for smart. So to go back to this definition, we can apply this and see how all the examples before were examples where the stronger alternative entails what the person really said and not the other way around. So just like we saw, brilliant entails smart. If someone is brilliant, they must be smart. But it's not the case that someone who's smart must be brilliant. Someone who's smart might be brilliant or they might not be brilliant. Same thing for the example with door number 1 and door number 2, right? If there's a prize behind door number 1, then it absolutely is true that there's a prize behind door number 1 or 2. But the opposite is not true, right? If I only know there's a prize behind door number 1 or 2, I might not be sure that there's a prize behind door number 1. And for the last one, right, if I've lived in the USA, UAE, and France, then it's definitely true that I've lived in the USA and UAE. So USA, UAE, France entails USA and UAE, but not the other way around. So it seems like at least we have a description for what kinds of things can be alternatives for what else. But there are some problems with what we've seen before. So we can define or explain what counts as an alternative, but we're going to see a lot of examples where these alternatives still don't seem to come up in implicatures. So first of all, a lot of implicatures that we will see are not based on ruling out alternatives like we've seen before. So just like we saw before, we saw that if someone says Josh is smart, the alternative they could have said is Josh is brilliant. So we think, why didn't she say Josh is brilliant? She must think Josh is not brilliant. Again, that's a scalar implicature. There are many implicatures that don't work that way. So to take one example, if I say, I slammed the door and a picture fell off the wall, this often implies that they happen in that order. First, I slammed the door and then the picture fell off the wall. So actually, the idea that they happen in a particular order is a stronger alternative. I could have said I slammed the door and then the picture fell off the wall, but I chose not to say that for some reason. But if I say I slammed the door and the picture fell off the wall, people usually will think that I mean I slammed the door and then the picture fell off the wall. So people will think that I mean the alternative. So for some reason, alternatives work differently in that kind of implicature than they do in the scalar implicature. Right? Thinking back to the scalar implicature, like Josh is smart, people will think, why didn't she say Josh is brilliant? She must mean Josh is not brilliant. But for this implicature, people won't think, why didn't he say and then? He must not mean and then. He must mean they didn't happen in that order. That's not what happened, right? So for some reason, scalar implicatures involve ruling out alternatives or canceling alternatives, but this kind of implicature does not. So that is something that will need to be explained at some point, why alternatives work differently for some implicatures. Another thing that we will see is there are a lot of alternatives that people don't consider and they don't make implicatures about. So for example, if I say, that's a cat, then a stronger alternative for that would be any sentence that entails that's a cat and is not entailed by that's a cat. And in fact, there's an infinite number of sentences that could do that because we could just add more things onto the sentence. So for example, that's a cat and I like ice cream. That sentence is stronger than just that's a cat because it entails it, right? If it's true that something is a cat and it's true that I like ice cream, then it must be true that something is a cat. And we could keep on adding things. We could say, that's a cat, and I like ice cream, and the earth is round. That is a stronger sentence than just that's a cat, according to the definition I gave you earlier. But if I say that's a cat, then people usually won't think, well, why didn't he say that's a cat, and I like ice cream, and the earth is round? He must not mean all of those things. Usually we just won't even think about that other stuff. So again, we would need some explanation of how we constrain which alternatives we think about in the conversation, which alternatives we really think, why didn't he say that alternative, and which alternatives never get considered. So these are some issues that we will take up in the next module, now that we have sort of a clear idea and definition of what an alternative is and why it's important for understanding scalar implicatures.